In 1943, Hans Müller pressed his face against the cold glass of a train car, watching the American expanse roll away into endless waves of green fields. Just 3 months earlier, he had been fighting in the scorching deserts of North Africa, convinced that America was a nation on the brink of collapse, weakened by luxury and moral decay. Now, as a prisoner of war heading to a camp somewhere in rural Kansas, he was about to discover just how badly Nazi propaganda had fooled him. Little did Hans know, as the train carried him deep into the American heartland, that he was about to become part of one of the most remarkable and largely forgotten chapters of World War II. Over the next 3 years, nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war would be scattered among more than 500 camps across the United States, and what they found there would shatter everything they knew about their enemy. The story begins not in America, but on the burning sands of North Africa, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was making its last desperate stand against British and American forces. It was May 1943, and the last German strongholds in Tunisia were crumbling under relentless Allied pressure. Within weeks, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers had surrendered, creating an immediate crisis that no one could have foreseen. What do you do with 250,000 enemy prisoners when you're fighting a global war on multiple fronts? The British Isles were already overcrowded and under constant threat of bombing. Transporting the prisoners back to England would take up precious shipping needed for the war effort. The solution, though controversial, was both practical and unprecedented: transport them across the Atlantic to camps on American soil. The decision sent shockwaves through American society. Enemy soldiers, real Nazis, would soon be living next door, working their fields and breathing the same free American air. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about the Nazi invasion of America, while mothers worried about prisoners in boots marching through their peaceful towns. But the reality was far more complex and surprising than anyone could have imagined. The first ships carrying German prisoners of war began arriving in American ports in the summer of 1943. These were not the stereotypical marching fanatics of war propaganda. Many were young conscripts barely out of their teens, caught up in the rapid collapse of the Afrika Korps. Others were seasoned veterans who had endured years of desert warfare, but now faced an uncertain future thousands of miles from home. Disembarking in ports like Norfolk and New York, the prisoners got their first taste of American abundance. After months of meager rations in North Africa, they were astonished by the quantity and quality of food available. White bread, fresh meat, and vegetables that many had not seen in years. But that was only the beginning of their introduction to American society. A trip inland gave the prisoners their first real glimpse of America beyond the coastal cities. Mile after mile of fertile land stretched to the horizon, dotted with thriving farms and small towns that showed no signs of the ravages of war. This was not the America they had been told about. A nation brought to its knees by conflict, where citizens starved and a government squandered resources on other people's wars. Klaus Bernhard, a 19-year-old machine gunner from Bavaria, would later write in his memoirs of staring at the passing landscape in absolute bewilderment. Where were the ruined cities? Where were the signs of a nation struggling to survive? Everything looked so normal, so prosperous. It made no sense given everything we had been taught. The camps themselves were another revelation. Built to Geneva Convention standards and regularly inspected by representatives of the International Red Cross, they bore little resemblance to the harsh detention facilities prisoners might expect. The barracks were clean and heated, with ample space for each person. There were recreation areas, libraries, even places of worship. The American guards, while maintaining discipline, did not display the brutality that many prisoners had seen in Nazi institutions. But perhaps the most shocking discovery for many German prisoners was the presence of women in positions of power in and around the camps. Nurses, administrative staff, teachers, and even some guards were women. a sight that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught them about the role of women in society. In Nazi Germany, women were expected to tend to children, the kitchen, and the church. The idea that women had power over men, especially their enemies, was almost incomprehensible. Lieutenant Werther Hoffmann, captured in Tunisia, described in his diary the first time he met an American nurse. She spoke to us with authority, gave orders to prisoners and guards alike, and professionally attended to our medical needs. I had never seen anything like it. In Germany, such a woman would have been considered unnatural. Here, however, she was respected by all. The culture shock extended beyond professional situations. When prisoners were allowed to interact with local communities through work programs, they encountered American women who drove cars, owned businesses, and were active in community life. These women were not the submissive housewives portrayed as the ideal in Nazi propaganda. They were self-confident, educated, and clearly valued by their society in ways that challenged fundamental Nazi beliefs about gender roles. Food, however, remained perhaps the most immediate and vivid symbol of American affluence. The Hamburg steak, which Americans simply called a hamburger, became an almost mythical symbol among prisoners. It was ground beef, formed into patties and cooked to perfection, served with fresh vegetables and bread. It was simple, filling, and represented everything prisoners said they lacked in America: quality meat, fresh ingredients, and the wealth to serve such dishes regularly. Franz Waber, a former tank commander, recalled his first hamburger with amazement. They served it to us as if it were nothing special, just ordinary food. But to us, who had lived on ersatz coffee and turnip soup for months before our capture, it was like an officer's feast. And this was what they fed the prisoners, their enemies. The abundance was not limited to special occasions or propaganda purposes. Dish after dish, the quality and quantity of the food was consistently high. Fresh vegetables, real coffee, meat at every supper, and bread made from real wheat flour, not the potato and sawdust mixtures that had become common in Germany. For many prisoners, the food in American camps was better than what they had eaten as free men at home. This culinary revelation forced many German prisoners to confront uncomfortable truths about the situation back home. If America could afford to feed enemy prisoners so well, what did that say about Nazi claims of American weakness and economic collapse? If the United States had such abundant resources that it could provide generous amounts of quality food to those it fought against, how strong must the American war machine be? Work programs added another layer of complexity to the American POW experience. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men could be pressed into labor, and the United States took full advantage of this provision. As American farm laborers were drafted into military service, POW labor became necessary to maintain food production. German prisoners found themselves in the very fields that produced the bounty they enjoyed. The irony was not lost on many of them. Here they were, enemy soldiers, working to help feed the nation they had fought against only months earlier. But working conditions were generally fair. The pay, though modest, was real, and the treatment by American supervisors was professional. Many prisoners came to appreciate the dignity that came from productive labor, in stark contrast to propaganda. Images of American capitalism as purely exploitative. Working alongside American civilians provided daily opportunities for cultural exchange, despite language barriers and official restrictions on flirting. These interactions revealed another aspect of American society that ran counter to Nazi teachings: the casual egalitarianism of American social relations. Farmers who worked alongside their employees, managers who treated workers with basic respect, and a general lack of the rigid class hierarchy that characterized German society. Otto Richter, a former artillery sergeant, described his work on a Nebraska farm. The owner, Mr. Johnson, brought us cold water on hot days and thanked us for our work. He showed us photographs of his son fighting somewhere in the Pacific and I could see the pain in his eyes. Yet he treated us with basic human decency. Such behavior is not characteristic of a people consumed by hatred. These daily interactions, we were told, began to humanize Americans in the eyes of German prisoners, just as the prisoners were humanized in the eyes of their captors. The propaganda image of Americans as soft, decadent, and morally corrupt was difficult to maintain in the face of evidence of their hospitality, hard work, and fundamental decency. The educational programs offered in many camps provided another avenue for cultural discovery. English classes became incredibly popular among prisoners not only for practical reasons, but also because learning the language opened the door to American literature, newspapers, and direct interaction with guards and civilians. Reading American newspapers for the first time, many prisoners were shocked by the open criticism of government policy, the lively debates about military strategy, and the general freedom of expression that characterized the American media. In Nazi Germany, newspapers had been organs of state propaganda, carefully controlled and censored. The idea that a free press could criticize its own government, especially during wartime, was revolutionary for people who had lived under totalitarian control. The revelation planted seeds of doubt about the superiority of the Nazi system and its claims about the weakness of democratic societies. Camp worship services provided another window into American values. Camp chaplains, both military and civilian, held services for prisoners of various Christian denominations, treated the prisoners with genuine pastoral concern, and spoke of concepts such as forgiveness and redemption, even in the context of war. This stood in stark contrast to the Nazi use of Christianity, which twisted religious messages to achieve political ends. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic chaplain who served in several POW camps, later wrote of his experiences. These young men were searching for meaning in what had happened to them, trying to understand how they had ended up so far from home, fighting for ideas that many of them had never truly questioned. Our conversations were not about converting them to American ideas, but about helping them find their own moral compass. The psychological impact of this religious involvement was profound for many of the prisoners. It offered them a framework for making sense of their experiences that existed outside the political ideologies that had shaped their early lives. The concept of individual moral responsibility, emphasized in American religious traditions, offered an alternative to the collective guilt and blind obedience demanded by Nazi ideology. As 1943 turned to 1944 and new batches of prisoners of war arrived from the European theater, the camps began to develop their own unique cultures. Prisoners organized their own entertainment, formed orchestras and theater groups, and published newspapers that were allowed to be distributed inside the camps. These activities revealed the intellectual and cultural sophistication of many German prisoners, challenging American stereotypes just as American reality challenged German prejudices. The camp at Concordia, Kansas, became famous for its POW orchestra, which played everything from classical German compositions to American popular music. The sight of German prisoners playing the Star-Spangled Banner with obvious skill and visible respect disconcerted many American visitors and belied simple notions of enemy image. Hans Miller, the young soldier we met at the beginning of this story, found himself in a camp in rural Texas, where the cultural contrasts were perhaps even more dramatic. The wide-open spaces, the easy friendliness of the locals, and the sheer scale of American agriculture presented a daily challenge to everything he had been taught about American society. In letters home that were censored but not destroyed, Hans wrote to his mother, "The farms here are larger than whole villages back home, but they are worked by families, not by groups. Americans treat their land with respect, but also with confidence, as if they knew it would always provide food. There is an optimism here that I find hard to understand. This optimism, perhaps more than any other characteristic, distinguished American society from what the prisoners had known in Nazi Germany. Despite their participation in a brutal world war, despite their daily losses and enormous expenses, Americans seemed to retain a fundamental confidence in their future. This was not the desperate determination of a nation fighting for its survival, but the firm will of a people confident of its ultimate victory. The prison camps became laboratories of cultural exchange, places where two very different societies met in controlled but increasingly relaxed conditions. As the war progressed, the prospect of a German victory faded. Many prisoners began to consider their post-war futures with a new outlook on the kind of society they wanted to help build. The transformation was not universal, of course. Hardcore Nazi sympathizers remained defiant, creating tensions within the camps and sometimes leading to violence between prisoners of different political persuasions. But for a significant number of German POWs, their American experiences planted the seeds of democratic thinking that would prove influential in post-war Germany. As we approach the halfway point of our story, it's worth pausing to consider the broader implications of what happened in these camps, scattered across the American landscape. Here were soldiers of Nazi Germany whose daily lives contradicted everything their former leaders had told them about their enemies. They were experiencing firsthand the prosperity, freedom, and basic human decency of the society they had fought to destroy. Hamburgers and working women were merely symbols of something much deeper, a fundamental clash between totalitarian propaganda and democratic reality. And when 1944 arrived, bringing with it new events that would further undermine the prisoners' worldview, the stage was set for even more profound revelations about the society that held them captive. None of them could have known that their American experiences were preparing them for roles they had never imagined. Bridges between two very different worlds, carrying the lessons learned in the steppe prison camps back to a Germany that would soon be rebuilt on entirely new foundations. The turning point came on a cool June morning in 1944, when prisoners gathered around radios in camps across America and heard the news that changed everything. D-Day had begun. Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, opening the long-awaited Second Front in Europe. For many German POWs, the moment crystallized a truth they had been reluctant to accept for months. Germany was losing the war. But it wasn't just the military reality that was changing in the camp. Something deeper was happening. Daily exposure to American life was creating what camp administrators later called the Great Awakening, a gradual but fundamental transformation in these German soldiers' understanding of democracy, freedom, and human dignity. Rudolf Schneider, a former Wehrmacht captain imprisoned at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, captured the moment in his diary. Today I watched American soldiers greet the news of D-Day with quiet satisfaction rather than wild celebration. They knew they were winning, but there was no hatred in their voices when they spoke of Germany. How different from the way we were taught to think of our enemies. The reaction to D-Day revealed something crucial about the American character that many prisoners had not expected: the absence of vengeful hatred. Despite years of brutal war, despite the truth about Nazi atrocities that was beginning to emerge, the American guards and civilians the prisoners encountered demonstrated a remarkable ability to separate the German people from their leaders. This distinction became even more apparent when news of the concentration camps began to reach the POW camps in late 1944 and early 1945. American authorities made the difficult decision to show prisoners documentary footage and photographs from liberated camps, such as Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald. The viewings were mandatory, but they were accompanied by careful psychological preparation. The impact was devastating and transformative. Many prisoners genuinely believed that the concentration camps were simply work facilities or had accepted the Nazi propaganda of protective custody. Confronted with irrefutable evidence of systematic murder and torture, the prisoners experienced a profound crisis of identity and belief. Werner Hoffmann, the lieutenant we had met earlier, wrote about viewing the footage from Dachau. I sat in that room with 200 other German soldiers, looking at images that I still cannot fully comprehend. The silence was deafening. Grown men wept openly. We had to confront the terrible truth that we had served a system capable of such evil. The Americans who showed us the footage did not gloat or celebrate our shock. They looked at our faces with something that almost looked like sympathy. The American approach to this revelation was crucial to its impact. Rather than using the evidence as a weapon of psychological warfare, camp administrators presented it as an opportunity for moral reckoning. Discussion groups were set up, led by American chaplains and teachers, where prisoners could process what they had seen and begin to understand their own complicity in the Nazi system. This was not an attempt to break the prisoners' spirit. It was an attempt to help them regain their moral compass. The distinction was important because it reflected core American values about redemption and the possibility of personal transformation. Even enemy soldiers were seen as capable of moral growth if given the right opportunities and guidance. The re-education programs that emerged from this crisis represented one of the most ambitious social experiments in American history. Drawing on the expertise of universities across the country, the programs combined practical education about democratic institutions with deeper philosophical discussions of individual rights, civic responsibility, and moral reasoning. Dr. Henry, a German Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi Germany and now taught at Harvard, was one of the key architects of these programs. His approach was revolutionary. Rather than simply condemning Nazi ideology, he helped prisoners understand the intellectual and historical roots of democratic thinking. "You can't just tell someone that democracy is better, Doctor," Mann explained to his American colleagues. "You have to help them understand for themselves why individual dignity matters, why free thought leads to wiser decisions, why societies thrive when they celebrate diversity rather than demand uniformity." The study groups that emerged were very different from anything the prisoners had encountered in their German education. Instead of memorization and unquestioning obedience to authority, the American model of education emphasized critical thinking, open debate, and the analysis of competing ideas. Prisoners were encouraged to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and form their own informed conclusions. Gustav Weber, a former tank commander, described his first political science class. "The American professor essentially asked us what we thought about democracy. Not what we had been told to think, but what we believed. When I said I thought it would lead to chaos, he did not dismiss my concerns. Instead, he asked me to examine the historical evidence and draw my own conclusions. It was the first time in my adult life that my opinions were taken seriously." The transformation was not limited to formal education. Everyday life in the camps continued to provide practical lessons in democratic values. Prisoners were allowed to form their own organizations, elect representatives, and participate in decisions about camp life. These exercises in self-government were revolutionary for men who had lived their entire adult lives under authoritarian control. Prisoner committees emerged to take charge of everything from meal planning to conflict resolution. The Americans were supportive, but they allowed the Germans to make their own mistakes and learn from them. This practical experience in democratic decision-making proved more valuable than any textbook on political theory. The economic dimension of American society continued to astound the German prisoners as the war progressed. Even though the United States was fighting on multiple fronts, supporting allies around the world and maintaining a massive military, there was no sign on the home front of the kind of poverty that was ravaging Germany. American prisoners ate well, wrote letters home, and even earned small amounts of money for their work. The Sears catalog became an unexpected symbol of American prosperity. The prisoners spent hours poring over pages of goods available to ordinary American families, appliances, clothing, tools, and luxuries that were completely unavailable in wartime Germany. The catalog represented not only material abundance, but also the certainty that such abundance would continue indefinitely. They had catalogues thicker than our military manuals, noted Friedrich Müller, a prisoner at Camp Butner, North Carolina, filled with goods that any family could order and have delivered to their home. This was a nation that did not expect to lose the war and did not fear for its future. This was a nation that took prosperity for granted. The role of American women continued to fascinate and challenge the German prisoners throughout their captivity. As the war progressed and more American men were drafted, women assumed ever more prominent positions in society. Prisoners saw women working as administrators, teachers, mechanics, and in a host of other occupations that would have been unthinkable for women in Nazi Germany. The camp at Aliceville, Alabama, was led by Colonel Mary Hoverin, one of the highest-ranking female officers in the U.S. Army. Her authority over German prisoners, including former officers who had never taken orders from a woman, became a powerful symbol of American values that emphasized gender equality and individual ability over rigid social roles. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Bergmann, a Prussian officer from an old military family, had a hard time coming to terms with this reality. In my country, the idea of a woman commanding men would be seen as a perversion of the natural order. Yet Colonel Hoverin runs her camp more effectively than many of the male officers I served under in the Wehrmacht. She is respected by her subordinates and feared by troublemakers. I have to admit that perhaps our understanding of women's capabilities was limited. The dating and courtship behavior that prisoners observed in American society provided another window into democratic values. American women had considerable freedom in choosing their romantic partners, and relationships seemed to be based on mutual affection and compatibility, rather than on familial arrangements or social expectations. For prisoners who were allowed supervised contact with their local communities, observing young American couples at church parties or social events provided a model of male-female relationships based on equality and mutual respect. This was especially striking to prisoners who had been taught that strong men should dominate submissive women. The American legal system also impressed many prisoners with its emphasis on individual rights and due process. When conflicts arose between prisoners, American military law provided clear procedures, rights to representation, and appeals processes. Even enemy prisoners were entitled to fair treatment according to established rules. Otto Kellner, a former SS officer who had initially been one of the most resistant prisoners, was profoundly changed when he was falsely accused of assaulting a guard. The American military justice system provided him with a lawyer, allowed him to present evidence in his favor, and ultimately acquitted him of all charges when the real culprit confessed. "They could have just punished me and been done with it," Kellner later wrote. Who would question the treatment of an SS officer? But they followed their rules, even when it was easier not to. That experience taught me more about fairness than years of Nazi lectures on force and order. The integration of prisoners into American farm work provided daily examples of another democratic principle, the dignity of labor, regardless of social status. German society had rigid distinctions between mental and physical labor, elaborate hierarchies based on education and family status. In America, prisoners observed farm owners working alongside their employees, professors working in factories during the summer, and successful businessmen starting out as laborers. The American dream, the idea that individual effort and merit could transcend social origin, was a revolutionary concept for prisoners in a society obsessed with blood, ancestry, and hereditary status. By observing their American guards, many prisoners began to understand that social mobility was not only possible, but expected in American society. James O'Sullivan, an Irish-American farmer who hired German prisoners in Iowa, was a shining example of this principle. He had arrived in America as a penniless immigrant, worked his way through agricultural college, and built one of the most successful farms in the area. His story, told casually during lunch breaks, illustrated opportunities that simply did not exist in the rigid class structure of Nazi Germany. The religious dimension of American society continued to challenge prisoners' prejudices. Unlike Nazi Germany, where Christianity was subjugated and distorted by political ideology, American churches maintained their independence and spoke prophetically on moral issues. Prisoners who attended services were struck by sermons that emphasized individual conscience, personal responsibility, and the equal value of all human beings. Father Thomas McCarthy, a Catholic priest who conducted services in several camps, recalled the lively theological discussions that arose. These young men had many questions about how to reconcile their faith with what they had done during the war. American Christianity, with its emphasis on personal redemption and an individual relationship with God, offered them a way forward that Nazi Christianity never did. The approach of victory in Europe brought new complications to life in the camps. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, prisoners had to confront difficult questions about their post-war future. Many had homes in areas that would become part of Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. Others feared retribution from their countrymen for their perceived collaboration with American prisoners. The American response to these concerns revealed another dimension of democratic values, a commitment to human rights, even for former enemies. Rather than simply repatriating all prisoners immediately after the war, American authorities developed elaborate procedures to protect prisoners who might face persecution. Those who had actively participated in re-education programs were given priority for resettlement assistance. Heinrich Bauer, a former Hitler Youth leader who had become one of the most diligent students in democracy classes, faced particular danger when returning to his hometown, which was now under Soviet control. American authorities arranged for his resettlement in West Germany and provided him with documentation of his re-education participation, which helped him find employment with the new democratic government. The end of the war in May 1945 created a strange atmosphere in the camps. Many prisoners experienced a complex mix of emotions: relief that the fighting had ceased, grief for their defeated homeland, anxiety about their future, and gratitude to their American guards. The victory celebrations they witnessed were noticeably muted, focusing more on the hope for a lasting peace than on Germany's humiliation. General George Patton's famous remark that the Americans would need German allies against the Soviet Union proved prophetic. Even before the war ended, American policymakers were considering how former German soldiers could contribute to rebuilding their country as a democratic ally. Prisoner re-education programs were already seen as investments in Germany's democratic future. The repatriation process, which began in 1945 and continued until 1946, was the final test of the program's effectiveness. Prisoners who returned to Germany brought with them not only memories of American affluence, but also practical experience of democratic institutions and a new understanding of individual rights and responsibilities. Many became active in rebuilding German society. Heinrich Weber, the former tank commander we met earlier, returned to become a teacher and then a school administrator, introducing American teaching methods that emphasized critical thinking rather than rote memorization. His classroom became a laboratory for democratic education in the new Federal Republic of Germany. Klaus Bernhard, a young machine gunner from Bavaria, used his English skills and understanding of American business practices to help establish trade relations between German companies and their former adversaries. His success in bridging the cultural gap between the two societies was directly based on the lessons learned during his captivity. Not all prisoners, of course, embraced democratic values. Some returned to Germany embittered by their defeat and resentful of their captivity, no matter how well they had been treated. Others had difficulty adapting to the complexities and responsibilities of democratic citizenship after years of authoritarian simplicity. But the overall impact was remarkable. Studies conducted decades later found that German prisoners who had spent time in American camps were significantly more likely to support democratic institutions, participate in civic organizations, and oppose authoritarian movements. The investment in their re-education paid off for both German and American societies. The hamburgers and working women that had initially shocked German prisoners became symbols of something much deeper, a society that valued individual dignity, celebrated diversity, and believed in the possibility of human perfectibility. These were not just cultural differences. They were visible expressions of democratic values in everyday life. The story of German prisoners in America ultimately became a story about the power of example over propaganda, of everyday experience over ideological indoctrination. By treating their enemies with dignity, by standing firm in their own values, Americans demonstrated the strength of democratic societies in a way that no amount of political rhetoric could have achieved. When the last German prisoners left American shores in 1946, many carried with them letters from their American guards, addresses of families who had shown them kindness and, most important, a new understanding of what free societies could achieve. They returned to help build a new Germany that would become America's strongest ally in Europe and one of the most stable democracies in the world. The women who shocked them with their power became models for the gender equality that would gradually transform German society. The hamburgers that symbolized American affluence became a reminder that free societies could provide prosperity for all their citizens, not just their leaders. Hans Müller, the young soldier we saw boarding the train in 1943, returned to Germany in 1946 with a deep understanding of democratic values. He became a journalist, covering the reconstruction of his country and advocating for the democratic principles he had learned during his captivity. In his memoirs, published decades later, he wrote, "I went to America as an enemy and returned as a friend, not because they made me change my mind, but because they showed me a better way to live." The great irony of the German prisoners' experience in America was that captivity became a liberation from the narrow-mindedness, racial hatred, and authoritarian subordination that characterized Nazi society. In losing the war, these German soldiers found what they had not known they had been missing: the possibility of individual dignity, intellectual freedom, and participation in a society based on mutual respect rather than domination. Today, as we face new challenges to democratic values around the world, this experience offers important lessons about the power of example, the importance of treating even enemies with dignity, and the possibility of human transformation. Hamburgers and working women were only the first symbols of a society confident enough in its values to share them even with those who sought to destroy them. Ultimately, that confidence proved to be democracy's greatest weapon and its most lasting gift to the world.